The wind howled like a pack of wolves across the frozen plains, dragging the snow sideways in blinding sheets. White swallowed the world until even the line of the mountains blurred, and yet a figure moved against it, a giant of a man, shirtless though the air cut like knives. His hair, long and shockingly white, streamed loose against the storm. Each step he pressed into the drifts was heavy, deliberate, as though he carried the weight of more years than his body could rightly hold. Dakota Whitehair, once feared warrior, now wandered like a man punished by time itself. He did not seek warmth or company. Those things had abandoned him long ago. The storm was a mirror of his own solitude, merciless, endless, indifferent. But when he caught the faint cry carried by the gale, his stride faltered. He stood, snow clinging to the hard muscles of his chest, eyes narrowing. The cry came again, weak, pleading, the sound of life on the edge of breaking. Against the voice of his own weariness, he turned. Through the curtain of white, a broken wagon lay half buried in snow. One wheel splintered, canvas ripped open, its meager contents scattered like bones across the drifts. He pushed closer, breath steaming, until he saw her. A woman lay curled near the wreck, a quilt half frozen around her shoulders, her face pale as moonlight. Her lips trembled with words that barely found shape. She could not be much older than 25, though hardship had pressed sorrow deep into her features. He crouched, his shadow vast across her small frame. Her eyes fluttered open, glazed with frost, then fixed on him as though he had come not from earth but from the storm itself. "Please!" Her voice cracked like dry wood. "Please! I'm begging you." Dakota's jaw tightened. He looked away toward the endless snow, as though the blizzard might offer escape from the plea. He was too old for this, too old for tenderness, too old for the hunger in her eyes that asked more than survival. He muttered, almost to himself, "I am too old for love." The words sounded final, like stone dropped into a well. Her hand twitched, reaching feebly for him. "Don't leave me." The desperation carried no vanity, no false charm, only the naked instinct of a soul who refused to vanish nameless in the snow. For a long moment, Dakota stood unmoving, his silence as cruel as the wind. His life had been pared down to solitude for good reason. He had no family left, no children, no clan that claimed him. His white hair was a banner of years that had stripped him of place. To take her up now, to allow need into his cabin, into his heart, it was to risk being broken all over again. Yet as he watched her shiver, a memory stirred unbidden. Once, many winters past, he had lifted a child from beneath a collapsed lodge, carried her against his chest until warmth returned. That child had lived, though he never saw her again. Perhaps somewhere she still breathed, because he had not turned away. The storm screamed harder, burying wagon and woman alike in powder. Dakota growled under his breath, scooped her into his arms with startling ease and rose. She weighed nearly nothing, yet her presence was heavier than any burden he had carried in years. Her head lolled against his bare shoulder, lips whispering fragments of gratitude before slipping into silence. The trek back to his cabin was merciless. Snow clung to his skin like claws, biting into old scars that lined his back and arms. Each step sank deep, but he pressed forward, driven not by choice but by a stubborn defiance against letting life perish before him. He thought again of his own words, too old for love, and they burned with shame. Perhaps he was too old, but he was not yet too dead to feel the sting of compassion. By the time the outline of his cabin appeared through the white veil, his breath came ragged. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney. He had let the fire die hours ago, expecting no company but the storm. He shouldered the door open with a grunt, carried her inside, and laid her on the fur-covered bench by the hearth. The cabin smelled of cedar smoke and old leather, quiet as a tomb. He moved quickly then, not with tenderness but with efficiency born of habit. He stoked the fire until sparks leapt, set a kettle to heat, pulled blankets from his own bed to wrap her. She stirred, whispering again, "Please," though her eyes stayed closed. "Rest," he said roughly, his voice carrying both command and unease. He sat across from her, elbows braced on his knees, watching the firelight paint her features. She was not fragile in beauty, but resilient, marked by dust and hunger and winter's cruelty. Something about the way her brow furrowed even in sleep cut him deeper than the wind ever could. Hours passed like that. The storm raged on, shaking the cabin walls, but inside, warmth returned in slow increments. Her breathing steadied. A strand of damp hair clung to her cheek. Dakota reached without thinking, brushed it aside, then withdrew as though burned. He had no right. When at last her eyes opened again, faint light from the fire reflecting in them, she looked directly at him. "Why did you help me?" Her voice was ragged, yet steadier now. He stared at the flames, unwilling to meet her gaze. "Because no one else would." Her lips parted, a ghost of sorrow crossing them. "That's what they told me too." She turned her face into the blankets, tears mixing with thawing snow. Dakota's chest tightened. He had thought her plea in the snow was for life alone. But he heard now the deeper wound, rejection that had followed her long before the storm. He felt the mirror of it in himself, the same cold verdict of being unwanted, unnecessary. He rose suddenly, needing the distance of motion, and paced to the window. Outside was only white, endless and merciless. He pressed a hand against the cold glass. The storm was not letting up. Neither, it seemed, was she. Her voice, barely audible, drifted across the room. "Please. I'm begging you, don't send me away." His hand curled against the pane. Age and solitude had armored him, but her words pierced like an arrow through leather. For the first time in years he felt unsteady, as though the ground beneath him was not frozen earth, but a river breaking its ice. He did not turn to her, not yet, but the silence between them was no longer empty. It trembled with something dangerous, something alive. And outside, the storm hammered the walls as though daring him to decide what kind of man he still was. The fire cracked softly, embers rising like fragile spirits toward the low rafters. Warmth began to breathe life back into the cabin, though the storm outside had not relented. Dakota sat across from her, his massive frame still, his dark eyes half hidden beneath the fall of his white hair. Silence filled the space between them like a river too wide to cross. Eliza lay cocooned in his blankets, her face pale but slowly flushing with color as the blood returned to her cheeks. Each breath she took was shallow, but steadier than before, and with every sound of life from her, he felt the strange unease of a man who had not invited another heartbeat into his home in years. When she tried to sit, a faint moan slipped from her lips, and he moved before thinking, steadying her with a hand against her shoulder. His touch was careful, though the size of his hand dwarfed her frame. She flinched, not from fear, but from the shame of weakness. "I can manage," she whispered, though her trembling arms betrayed the lie. Dakota said nothing. He guided her back against the pelts and poured steaming water into a tin cup. From a pouch, he sprinkled herbs, bitter-smelling, the kind his mother once gathered from hillsides long gone. He pressed the cup into her hands. "Drink." Her fingers brushed his as she took it, fragile as bird bones. She lifted the cup, sipped, winced at the bitterness, but forced it down. Her eyes lingered on him, as if trying to read something hidden beneath the sternness of his face. "Why do you live out here alone?" He stirred the fire with the poker, sparks jumping. "Because silence does not lie," he said flatly. His gaze stayed on the flames, as though if he looked at her too long, the truth of her question might pierce deeper than he could allow. She studied him in the firelight. His scars told stories she could not yet name, long lines crossing his back, a pale mark on his ribs. His age showed not only in his white hair, but in the heaviness around his eyes, a man who had buried too many seasons. Yet beneath it, strength remained unbroken, and something in her chest tightened with the knowledge that this man, who claimed to be too old for love, had carried her from death itself without hesitation. When her trembling quieted, she asked softly, "What did you mean out there, when you said you were too old for love?" The words hung fragile in the air, but she would not let them go unanswered. Dakota froze, the fire's glow catching on the hard line of his jaw. His chest rose, fell, and he shook his head. "It means what it means." His voice was low, final. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself, lowering her eyes. Shame burned hotter than the fire in her chest. "Then I suppose I am only a burden to you." The words quavered with both pride and sorrow, as if she had been forced to speak them too many times before. He turned sharply, his eyes finally on her, dark as storm clouds. You are alive. That is all. She flinched at the bluntness, then stared at the flames until her vision blurred. Alive. Nothing more. Yet even in that dismissal, she felt something beneath it, some ache that was not cruelty but protection, of himself, not her. Hours trickled by, marked by the shifting storm's roar and the slow drip of thawing snow from her quilt. She dozed and woke in fragments, each time finding him there, tending the fire, grinding herbs, or sitting as still as carved stone. He never left the cabin, though his restlessness was a storm of its own. Once, when she stirred in pain, he reached for her ankle, rolling up the edge of the blanket to reveal the swelling bruise. His fingers probed gently, his eyes intent. She gasped at his touch, then bit her lip. I told you I can manage. You cannot walk on this. His tone carried no room for defiance. He wrapped her ankle with strips torn from his own shirt, movements efficient but careful. She noticed the tremor in his breath when her skin brushed his hand, though he masked it quickly. When he finished, she whispered, Why do you care at all? He tied the final knot, leaned back, and answered without looking at her. Because you begged me. She swallowed hard. The memory of her voice in the snow, desperate, pleading, shamed her, yet she clutched it too. For once, someone had listened. The night deepened. Outside, the blizzard clawed at the cabin, but inside, firelight softened the walls, casting them in amber hues. Eliza sat upright now, quilt pulled to her chin, studying him in silence. She could not reconcile the contradictions. The giant who strode shirtless through the storm, yet brewed herbs with the patience of a healer. The man who called himself too old for love, yet lifted her with a gentleness that denied indifference. At last she broke the silence. I have nowhere to go. His hand froze on the kettle. Slowly he turned his face toward her, eyes shadowed. That is not my burden. Tears gathered, though she blinked them back. Then send me into the storm. It would be kinder than pretending I belong anywhere. Her voice cracked, and she drew the blanket tighter, shrinking from him, bracing for rejection. Dakota's jaw clenched. He rose abruptly, pacing the cabin like a caged animal. His breath came rough, his hands curling at his sides. Finally he stopped, his back to her. I told you once. I am too old for love. Too old for ties. You will only find sorrow here. Her eyes closed, her body curling tighter in the quilt, but her voice came steady despite the tremor in it. Please. I'm begging you, don't send me away. The words cut through him sharper than wind. He turned slowly and for a moment, he saw not a stranger but himself, years ago, cast out by whispers, stripped of place, begging silently for worth. The fire hissed, throwing sparks upward, as if urging him to speak, to choose. But he stood caught in the ache of her plea, torn between the armor he had built and the stirrings he could not still. The storm pounded against the cabin walls, daring him to act. She waited, eyes glistening, breath shallow, the whole fragile weight of her hope suspended on the edge of his answer. And he could only stand there, silent, as if the decision would break him either way. The storm broke at last, leaving the world draped in white silence, but the silence was not peace. It was the pause before judgment. Dakota saddled his horse at dawn, the frost clinging to its mane, while Eliza wrapped herself in his quilt, her ankle bound but healing. She had argued weakly that she could remain in the cabin, yet he shook his head. Supplies were low. If she stayed, whispers would only grow sharper. If she came, they would sting her face as surely as the cold. The ride to town was long, the snow crunching beneath the horse's hooves, the air sharp with the bitter scent of pine. Eliza clung to him, her cheek pressed against his back, and though his body was hard as granite, she felt warmth beneath the scars. He said nothing the entire way, yet the silence between them felt more alive than the storm that had tried to claim her. When they reached the town, the world shifted. Faces turned. Curtains twitched. The giant Apache with his white hair, and the young woman draped in his quilt, made a sight that traveled faster than any wind. Children whispered, wide-eyed. Women pressed gloved hands to their mouths. Men muttered low and disapproving. They dismounted at the mercantile. The door's bell clanged, sharp as a warning. Inside, the air smelled of flour and lamp oil, but it carried something harsher, the weight of stairs. Eliza tried to lower her gaze, but her heart thumped painfully against her ribs. She had known the taste of gossip before, yet this burned hotter, for now it was not only her name but is bound with hers. Martha Calhoun stood near the counter, her bonnet framing a face pinched by righteousness. Her eyes traveled from Eliza's quilted shoulders to Dakota's weather-worn features, and her lips curled. "Well," she said loudly, "I see storms bring strange company these days." Dakota's back straightened, but he did not reply. He gathered flour, coffee, salt, his movements deliberate, his silence his shield. But Martha pressed on, her voice pitched to carry. "Some folks think themselves above decency. A young widow shacked up in a cabin, no vows spoken, no ring on her finger. What will the children in town learn from such shamelessness?" Eliza froze. The words struck like stones. Widow. Shameless. Burden. She felt every gaze digging into her skin, every whisper stripping away dignity she had only begun to gather. Her hands clenched around the edge of the quilt, and for a moment she wished the storm had taken her after all. Sheriff Amos Drayton entered just then, his spurs clinking against the wood floor. He was a man of 52, his face weathered by law and suspicion. His gaze landed on Dakota, narrowed. "You'd best tread careful, Whitehair. Folks won't stomach impropriety, not after all the years you've lived apart." Dakota met his eyes without flinching. "I've broken no law." "Law ain't all that matters," Amos said, his tone grave. "Reputation carries weight here. You tarnish hers, you answer to me." Eliza's throat tightened. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, but the words tangled in shame. Her ankle ached, her cheeks burned, and the quilt felt less like comfort than a brand. It was Nathaniel Pike who drove the knife deeper. A rancher of 34, his voice slick with mockery, he leaned against a barrel and smirked. "Look at him, old warrior, white as snow, playing husband to a girl half his age. Surprised he can lift her, let alone keep her." His laughter spread like kindling catching flame. Dakota's hand stilled on the sack of flour. His shoulders rose with slow breath, the muscles in his arms taut, but still he did not strike back. His silence was a weapon, though to Eliza it felt like surrender. Her shame reached its breaking point. She turned, voice trembling yet fierce, and faced the room. "I owe none of you my life, and yet it was this man who carried me from death. If that makes me shameless, then let shame be my name." The store fell quiet, stunned by her defiance. Martha's lips pressed tight, Amos's eyes flickered with unease, and Nathaniel sneered but said no more. Dakota looked at her then, truly looked, and for the first time she saw a spark in his eyes. Something like pride, something like recognition. They left with their supplies, the whispers following them out into the street like dogs on a scent. Eliza's body trembled, half from cold, half from the weight of what she had dared. She felt both broken and stronger than she had in years. Dakota walked beside her, carrying the goods in silence, but his presence loomed like a shield. As they reached the horse, Eliza touched his arm, her voice barely a whisper. "They will never see me as anything but a disgrace." He stared past her at the snow-bright horizon. "They never saw me as anything else either." The truth of it hung between them, heavy as the winter air. She searched his face, and for a heartbeat she wanted to tell him he was wrong, that she saw more. But the words caught on her tongue. Instead, she mounted the horse with his help, her ankle twinging, and held to him once more. The ride back was longer than before, the sky dimming, shadows stretching across the whitened land. She buried her face against his shoulder, not for warmth but for courage, and felt the rise and fall of his breath beneath her cheek. In the distance, smoke from the cabin curled upward, a fragile thread against the wide sky. Safety lay ahead, but so too did the weight of judgment pressing harder than the storm had. Dakota said nothing, but his silence was no longer the silence of indifference. It was a silence that trembled with choice, with the question of how much more he could carry. For her, for himself, for the dignity neither of them had yet claimed. When they reached the cabin, night had fully settled, the snow glittering under a thin moon. Dakota lifted her down gently, his hands firm around her waist. She looked up at him, eyes glistening, lips parted with words she could not yet voice. He stood still, towering against the pale light, his white hair catching the glow like frost. Inside, the fire waited, but neither moved to enter. The cold air clung to them, thick with something unspoken. Eliza's breath trembled as she whispered, "If the world calls me shameful, will you let it?" Takota's gaze locked with hers, unreadable, his silence stretched taut as a bowstring. The answer did not come, but the weight of it pressed between them like the promise of a storm yet to break. The cabin glowed with firelight, but warmth could not soften the heaviness that hung between them. Eliza sat near the hearth, her quilt drawn tightly, her face pale from the day's wounds that had cut deeper than the storm. Takota paced like a restless shadow, his frame filling the small room, his silence grinding louder than any words. Outside, the night pressed close, wind whispering against the walls like the gossip that had followed them home. She lifted her eyes to him, the flames reflecting in their glassy depths. "You said nothing," she murmured. Her voice cracked, not with anger but with the ache of being left alone in a room full of watchers. "Not to Martha. Not to the sheriff. Not even to that man who mocked you." Takota stilled, his back to her, shoulders squared like a mountain bracing against thunder. "Their words are smoke. Smoke vanishes." Her lips trembled. "But smoke suffocates before it fades. You think I do not know? I've lived in it so long, I can hardly breathe." He turned then, his face caught between shadows and firelight. The scars across his chest gleamed faintly, reminders of battles survived but never escaped. "If I spoke, they would not hear. My life has been judged since before you were born. White hair, old blood, empty hearth, I am nothing to them." Her chin lifted, fragile yet defiant. "And what am I then? Nothing too? A burden you carried from the snow and regret ever since." The words struck him harder than Nathaniel's sneer had. He flinched, though his face stayed carved from stone. Slowly, he crossed the space, crouched before her, his hands braced on his knees. "I carried you because you begged me. That is all." Her eyes filled, though she held his gaze with a stubborn steadiness. "And still I beg you," she whispered. "Do not send me away." The fire hissed, logs collapsing inward. Takota's breath shuddered, as though torn between pride and surrender. He looked away first, rising, pacing again. His white hair caught the flicker of light like snow turned to silver. Eliza wrapped the quilt tighter, speaking into the silence. "My husband died 3 winters past. His family said I was cursed, barren as the fields after locusts. They drove me out with nothing but shame in my hands. Shame follows me wherever I go. But today, in that store, when they called me shameless, I thought I might break. Until I saw you standing there, silent as stone, and for the first time I wished you would fight for me. Not because I deserve it, but because you might see me." Her confession hung trembling in the air. Takota closed his eyes, the weight of her words pressing against the old wounds he kept hidden. He remembered nights when he had begged his own people not to cast him aside for the whiteness in his hair, the sign they read as spirit-marked, cursed. His dignity had been stripped long before she ever looked at him. To fight for her now would mean facing the same wound he had buried beneath silence. He opened his eyes and found her watching him, her face lit with equal fear and hope. Something stirred within him, something he had sworn to bury, but which rose like fire through dry grass. "I see you," he said at last, his voice rough, as though dragged from deep earth. Her breath caught, and for a moment she looked as though those words alone had steadied her. Yet his gaze fell, the moment collapsing. "But what I see is a life I cannot give. I am too old, Eliza. Too weathered. Too marked." Her hand slipped from the quilt, trembling but brave, reaching for his. "Then let me decide what I can bear." He stared at her fingers, so small against his, but did not take them. He turned away once more, gripping the edge of the table until the wood creaked. The fire flared, shadows danced, and silence roared between them. The hours deepened into night. Eliza lay awake by the hearth, though her body begged for sleep. She listened to his footsteps pacing, each creak of the floorboards a reminder of the walls between them. At last, exhaustion claimed her, but her dreams were restless, filled with voices calling her shameless, her hands always reaching and never grasped. Dakota stood by the window, watching snow drift beneath the moonlight. His reflection in the glass looked like a ghost, hair white as frost, eyes hollowed by solitude. He lifted a hand, pressed it to the cold pane, and whispered words he had not spoken aloud in years. "Too old for love." Yet even as he said them, he thought of her voice, soft and desperate. "Please, I'm begging you." When dawn broke, the cabin seemed smaller than ever. Eliza stirred, rising slowly with the quilt around her shoulders. She limped to where he sat sharpening his knife, his expression unreadable. "Are you sending me away?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. He looked up, eyes dark, unreadable, the blade catching the morning light. "If you stay, you will be judged. Every day. Every whisper will weigh on you." She straightened, her face pale but her chin high. "Then let them whisper. I have been judged all my life. But here at least I am alive." For the first time, something like a smile ghosted across his lips. Not joy, but the flicker of admiration. He set the knife aside, rose and stepped toward her. His hand lifted, hesitated in the air between them, as if the space itself might shatter under the weight of touch. She waited, breath trembling, eyes wide, her body braced between hope and fear. But his hand fell back to his side. His silence was louder than any vow. He turned from her, gathering his coat, his posture heavy with decision. "I must see the sheriff," he said quietly. Her stomach dropped, dread curling cold through her veins. "Why?" He did not answer. He pulled the door open, the wind rushing in, scattering the fragile warmth. His white hair whipped against the light, and for a moment he looked less like a man than a figure carved from winter itself. Then he stepped out, leaving her with only the echo of his footsteps and the hollow ache of words unspoken. She clutched the quilt tighter around her, her eyes filling, her voice breaking as she whispered to the empty room. "Please, don't let this be the end." And outside, the wind carried her plea into the distance, where judgment waited like a storm yet to come. Snow fell in brittle flakes, brittle as ash, swirling through the pale morning when Dakota returned from town. His steps were heavy, each one pressing a choice into the frozen earth. Eliza waited by the fire, her face worn with a night of unanswered questions. When the door opened, she straightened, searching his eyes as though they might hold mercy. Instead, she saw the storm he carried within. "They will not stop," he said at last, setting his coat aside. "The sheriff warned me again. Martha's tongue runs faster than fire. Nathaniel stirs men with his mockery. Every whisper grows louder." Eliza drew the quilt tighter. Her voice trembled, though her chin was steady. "And what did you tell them?" Dakota's jaw clenched. He looked away to the window where snow drifted against the glass. "That I am too old to fight their words. Too old to start a war I cannot win." The words cut deeper than any blade. Eliza's breath caught, her heart twisting with both sorrow and fury. "And am I to carry this alone then? To stand in the fire while you turn away?" His eyes snapped back to hers, fierce as flint. "I carried you from death. Do not say I turned away." She rose, her ankle still weak, but her will unbent. "You saved my life, yes. But living is more than breathing. Living is dignity. And I would rather die in the storm than be shamed into silence again." The fire crackled, sparks leaping like the clash of their wills. For a long moment he only stared, his chest rising with the weight of words he could not yet speak. Then a shout broke the air outside. Men's voices. The heavy stamp of boots in snow. Dakota moved to the door, shoulders tense. Eliza followed, her breath tight. When he opened it, the scene beyond stole the air from her lungs. Nathaniel Pike stood in the yard, flanked by two men with hard eyes and restless hands. Behind them, townsfolk had gathered at a distance, drawn by gossip's call. Snow swirled around them, but it was not the storm that brought the chill, it was judgment given shape. Nathaniel's grin was cruel, his breath misting in the cold. "Brought yourself a wife out of the snow, Whitehair? Or just a plaything till she's worn thin?" The men beside him laughed, low and bitter. Eliza gasped, shame burning her cheeks. Dakota stepped forward, bare chest rising, his white hair whipping in the wind. "Leave!" Nathaniel spat into the snow. "Not till this town knows the truth. You're too old, too broken, to keep a woman. Let her speak it plain. Does she want an old ghost for a husband?" All eyes turned to Eliza. The crowd's silence pressed upon her shoulders. Her voice trembled inside her throat, but she found Dakota's gaze, dark, pained, searching. In his eyes she saw not weakness, but the fear of being cast aside once more. And she understood that his silence had always been armor, not abandonment. She stepped forward, out into the snow, quilt trailing behind her like a banner. "If he is old, then I am blessed by years I did not live. If he is broken, then I am healed by the strength he gives. This man carried me when no one else would. He is more to me than any of you with your sneers and your wagging tongues." A murmur rippled through the onlookers. Nathaniel's smile faltered, but his pride flared. He grabbed her arm, jerking her close. "Then you're a fool. And he's nothing but a relic." The moment shattered. Dakota lunged, his hand clamping around Nathaniel's wrist, forcing it away from her. The men surged forward, but Dakota's roar froze them, a sound as raw as the mountains. He shoved Nathaniel back, the younger man stumbling into the snow. "You speak of relics," Dakota growled, standing tall. "But I am not yet buried. I have fought storms fiercer than you, carried burdens heavier than your words. You call me too old, then hear me, age does not kill dignity. Cowardice does." The fire in his voice struck the air, shaking it. Nathaniel scrambled to his feet, face red, but the men beside him hesitated. The crowd wavered, whispers softening into silence. Dakota turned, his chest heaving, and faced Eliza. For the first time, his silence broke fully, the truth laid bare. "I said I was too old for love. But I was wrong. What I feared was not years, but the shame of being unwanted. You saw me anyway. You begged me not to send you away. And I cannot. Not now. Not ever." Eliza's eyes filled with tears that froze in the wind. She reached for his hand, clasping it tight. The gesture was quiet, but in it burned the fire of everything denied them both. The crowd shifted, uneasy, but no one dared speak. Nathaniel spat again, retreating, his pride crushed under the weight of a dignity greater than his mockery. One by one, the townsfolk drifted away, leaving the yard empty, but for the two of them. Snow swirled, but it felt different now, not cruel but cleansing. Dakota turned to her, his white hair gleaming in the gray light. "If you will have me," he said softly, "then let the storm bear witness." Her reply was simple, whispered into the hush of winter. "I will." The words lit something inside him, a flame long buried beneath ash. He gathered her into his arms, not as burden but as belonging. For the first time in years, the cabin did not stand as a monument to solitude, but as a shelter for two souls bound by more than survival. The wind eased, carrying their vows into the distance. The storm was ending, but what began in its heart would endure. And as the fire inside warmed them, the old soul of the land seemed to whisper a lesson meant not for them alone, but for any who would listen. Love is not measured in years or judged by tongues. It is found in the quiet courage of seeing another fully, and daring to be seen in return.